How do you do, Storyteller here, back with another 3 chapters from The Man with Two Faces from the Grey File series. We are beginning Chapter 4, entitled Union Street. The sound of his footsteps on the worn sidewalk along Union Street were drowned in the array of noises in the city. Voices murmured through the open doorways of shop fronts along the street where, outside, car engines rumbled and distant horns blared angrily in the road rage of the rush-hour traffic. Music played softly from some unseen speakers along the walkway, not loud enough to discern the words of the song, but just enough to give Sebastian a rhythm to walk to as he strolled closer to Building 17. He could see the looming structure up ahead, a concrete apartment tower several stories taller than any of the smaller shops and buildings around it. From the look of it, they seemed to be a high-income apartment building, the type a police detective's salary could never afford. The steps leading up to the revolving door were red-hued marble, and the room beyond was a revolving glass. And the room beyond the revolving glass door was elegantly low-lit by a crystal chandelier high overhead. Sebastian buried his hands into the pocket of his sweatpants and lowered his head as he stepped into the glamorous lobby. He clutched the wallet in his hand firmly, repeating the address in his mind. Apartment 541. On the 5th floor, likely, he sighed to himself, not wanting to be here any longer than he had to be. Smoothing the creases from his spotted t-shirt, he made a beeline for the elevator on the far side of the room, trying not to draw attention to himself. A soft chime rang as he hit the upward arrow button. The door slid open, and Sebastian quickly stepped inside and hit the bold letter 5 on the panel before the doors slid closed again. If you guys just saw the lighting change, it's because my light just swung around by itself. Excuse me, sorry for this intense close-up. There we go. Let's not do that again. Haunted light. Let's read that again. A soft chime rang as he hit the upwards arrow button. The door slid open and Sebastian quickly stepped inside and hit the bold letter 5 on the panel before the door slid closed again. Although thankful for the momentary seclusion, he was painfully aware of the lack of elevator music, the silence leaving him alone with his thoughts, providing no reprieve from the anxiousness in his mind. I have to sneeze. But I won't. When at last the doors slid open to reveal the outstretched hallway before him, Sebastian took a hesitant step out, the silence broken only by his shallow breaths and the padding of his house shoes on the dense burgundy carpeting. 541, he whispered out loud, disliking the sound of his voice echoing against the far walls of the hallway. Willing himself to keep moving forward, he scanned the doors for her room number, deciding that it was probably near the far end of the hallway. When her number came into view, he saw that the door was a rich dark wood with a brass door knocker. Standing in front of the door, Sebastian quickly preened himself as he summoned his courage. With a deep breath, he raised the knocker and let it clank down heavily against the door. A few moments passed, during which he considered dropping the wallet on the door mantel and running off until a rustling sound on the opposite side froze him in place. In a smooth sweep, the door slid open inward, and a woman's form appeared half concealed behind the door as a barricade. Lifting his gaze from the carpet, they were caught up all at once by the sharp mahogany orbs gazing curiously at him from the doorway beneath the shadow of black bangs. A graceful hand flitted up to tuck a strand of her long hair behind her ear as she seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Miss Baxter?" he managed to whisper. That fell from his lips more like a sigh than a whisper. I probably said it more loudly than he would have. More like, "Miss Baxter?" he managed, a whisper that fell from his lips more like a sigh than a word. Her chin lifted slightly at the call of her name. "Yes?" she asked softly, still clinging to the doorframe. Sebastian wordlessly held out the letter the little checkered wallet, which looked so fragile in his calloused hand. Her eyes drifted down to his hand before lighting up, a faint, "Oh," barely visible as she took the wallet. "Thank you. Where did you find it?" she asked, still clutching it to her, gazing up with grateful eyes that stole the breath from his lungs. Her eyes are just like roses. The thought he had tried so hard to suppress invaded his mind before he could stop it. He pushed it out at once, trying hard not to let his anguish show on his face as he answered, "You accidentally dropped it when I bumped into you in the street earlier. It's my duty to return lost property to the rightful owner, if within my power," he rambled, not truly knowing what he was pouring out of his mouth as he calmed his staggering breaths. Her head perked up, and her face became gravely serious. "Are you a police officer?" Sebastian tilted his head, running a hand back through his greasy hair, cringing at the feeling of the slime while taken aback by her question. "Not exactly," he stammered. "I'm a detective," he added. She nodded, deeply considering before softly whispering, "Can you help me?" Puzzled, Sebastian reflected her vigorous nodding. "Of course. What do you need?" he asked, burrowing his hands deeper into his pockets. Her eyes darted back and forth, down the hallway and beyond the door, lowering her voice even softer to say, "I can't tell you here. You have to meet with me. Tonight. Do you know where the Red Tie Company Club is?" "The Red Tie Country Club is. It's not a company club. It's a country club." "Do you know where the Red Tie Country Club is?" Sebastian paused for a moment, studying her face, which radiated with fear and anxiousness. "I've seen it. It's near the Commons, right?" She continued nodding swiftly. "Wade is hosting a party tonight for a bunch of important people. Lawyers and judges, politicians, that sort. I need you to be there tonight. The party starts at 8 o'clock at the Red Tie Club. They won't let you in if you're not a town official, but tell them you're a councilman. They'll let you in without checking. But you've got to be there. Please. I'll explain tonight, but just be there." As she finished, she abruptly shut the door before he could ask any more questions. Sebastian stood at the door for several long moments, trying to process what had just happened. Somehow, he had been asked to attend an exclusive party at a ritzy nightclub, hosted by the leading mayoral candidate for the city of Boston, disguised as a town councilman, to gain access to the party, to meet with a strange woman he'd only just met this afternoon, to help with some unknown task he'd agreed to without any information. It was strange. The whole situation felt suspicious, and it was definitely going to be dangerous. Yet, for all those reasons, he wouldn't dare miss this opportunity. The detective smiled to himself, feeling his adrenaline rush throughout his body as the prospect of a new case came unfolding. With a strut in his stride, Sebastian danced to the doors of the elevator and hit the button, taking one last look down the hallway before he stepped into the lift. He drew in a breath, and in a voice thick with renewed vigor, he boomed, "Dear God, it feels good to be back." End of Chapter 4. We are on to Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Red Tie. Scalding hot water streamed down the detective's back as he rinsed the shampoo from his slick black hair. Whistling loudly and mostly off-key to himself, Sebastian tilted his head back into the rush of water, breathing in the steam and letting the heat relax his muscles. Having shaved and showered, Sebastian turned the steel knob to shut off the water, and reached out blindly for his towel before stepping into the humid air of the bathroom. Rubbing away the condensation from the mirror, he leaned in closely to his reflection, examining the handiwork with the razor to find that he was mostly cleanly shaven. Taking his brush from off the ledge of the sink, he slicked back his lengthy black hair off of his face, making his ice-blue eyes even more striking against his tanned skin. Placing the brush back, he made his way into the bedroom where his clothes were spread out on the bed. Sebastian quickly dried himself off and began getting dressed, knowing it was getting close to 8 o'clock. The Red Tie was a formal country club, so he had set out his black suit, a pressed white shirt, and his mirror-shined black dress shoes. Ironically, Sebastian didn't own a single tie, so he usually wore his collar open and barely popped up, liking the way that it looked. He pulled his dress shirt on over his warm, damp skin, fastening each tiny button while holding his breath. He pulled on his black dress pants and slid on his black jacket, glad to find that it still fit after not wearing it since the previous year. Slipping on his socks and shoes, he headed to the bathroom for a few sprays of his favorite cologne, in a sleek black bottle. This was her favorite cologne, too. He growled as the thought slipped into his mind, the smell of the freshly sprayed cologne suddenly offensive with the memories it triggered. He pushed the memories away and looked up into the mirror, pausing as he realized something. He looked like his old self, the one he hadn't seen in so long. Confident, handsome, suave, someone he hadn't been in a long time. A smile spread over his lips as he popped the collar of his dress shirt up, chuckling as he turned around in the mirror, feeling his confidence renewed. The smile was still spread over his lips as he glanced down at his wristwatch, a present for his 25th birthday 3 years ago. It was 7:41. He decided he should leave early since he planned to walk to the club across the Boston Commons. The decent trek would give him time to collect his thoughts, so he snagged his keys and his wallet off the table as he left the room, crossed the small living room, and made his way toward the door. Locking the apartment behind him, Sebastian stepped out into the cool night breeze that swept along Franklin Street with a low howl. The path was crowded as always, with pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalk in all directions. He walked with his arms swinging by his sides as he followed the walkway through the downtown area, which skirted the perimeter of the Boston Commons, which were aglow with lights strung across the trees, across the walkway to create a tunnel of colored lights. Across the Commons, he spotted a large white-pillared building from a bygone era. The massive structure, seemingly frozen in time, was illuminated with soft yellow light through tall, narrow windows lining the far walls. As he got closer, Sebastian could see cars being passed to valet attendants, and at the door, well-dressed figures were ushered into the front door of the building, where 2 large men stood guarding the door. Sebastian felt his nervousness building as he saw the men stopping each person at the door, hoping Lucy was right about her plan. He filed into line with the men in formal suits and women in extravagant dresses waiting to get inside. As he reached the doorway, one of the enormous bouncers, a head and shoulders taller than Sebastian and much heavier, put up a hand to stop him, asking his name. Sebastian straightened his back, broadened his chest, and concealed a tremble in his voice as he answered, "Councilman Gray." The 2 Goliath men glanced at each other, one lifting an eyebrow while the other giving the detective a once-over. Sebastian crossed his arms over his chest, suddenly feeling exposed and wondering if they'd called his bluff, when the man waved him onward. Relieved, Sebastian passed through the doorway and instantly let out a breath he had been holding, deflating his broadened chest and wiping the sweat away from the back of his neck as he stepped into the massive ballroom. The ceiling above was several stories high and illuminated with brilliant silver candle fixtures, which all seemed to be flame-lit. The floor of the ballroom was smooth black and gray marble, which sparkled when caught the light just right. I'm butchering my sentences, by the way. Banquet tables lined the far wall with draping white tablecloths set up with sparkling silver platters and bowls with endless arrays of food. On the right side of the room, Sebastian spotted a beautifully rustic redwood bar with brass fixtures. The stools glistened, finely polished, and behind the bar were shelves lined with bottles of all colors, shapes, and ages. Sebastian glanced around the room at the sea of strange faces, choosing to retreat to the bar to await his contact. She had told him not to look for her, that she would find him. So to avoid conversations with anyone that might ruin his cover story, he fled quickly to the magnificent bar and took a seat on one of the empty stools. Behind the bar, a middle-aged balding man, dressed in black dress shirt with an apron tied around his waist, turned to face Sebastian as he sat. The man held a short wine glass and a cloth in his hand, polishing the glass vigorously as he asked, "What can I get you, my friend?" Sebastian gazed up blindly at the assortment of bottles behind the bartender, hesitating as he sheepishly asked, "What's good?" The man chuckled, setting the glass down and leaning closer as he asked, "I'm guessing you aren't a drinker?" Sebastian shook his head with a slight grin, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. The man waved away Sebastian's hesitation, still whispering as he noted, "Don't worry, I've got soft drinks too. How does a lemon lime sound? It kinda looks like vodka. Real inconspicuous." Sebastian smiled brightly, his teeth glistening under the dazzling candlelight of the ballroom. "That would be great, thank you." The man gave a reassuring nod, with a wink as he pulled the brass nozzle hose from beneath the counter, and filled the freshly polished glass with the bubbling clear soda. Like clockwork, he reached into a metal bowl with a curved spoon, and scooped up 2 massive ice cubes, dropping them into the drink without splashing it. He finished it off with a fresh lime wedge taken from a small compartment below the bar, squeezing it into the drink before piercing the wedge on the brim of the glass. "There," the bartender said as he wiped the outside of the glass with a towel, before sliding it across the bar. "You'd never spot the difference." The detective chuckled, nodding with sincere amazement as he asked, "What do I owe you?" The bartender waved dramatically again. "Not a thing. Your host, Mr. Chandler, paid for an open bar tonight. I'm here to deliver." "Oh," Sebastian thought. "Well, thank you." The man gave another wink and a nod as he turned and snatched up another glass to polish. Taking a sip of his soda, blended with the freshness of the lime, Sebastian breathed a relaxed sigh as he turned back to gaze across the crowd and study their faces. This time, as his eyes scanned the faces around him, he spotted Lucy across the room. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, while her dark bangs still draped just above her sharp eyebrows. She was wearing a sleek black dress which ever so subtly clung to her curves and draped across one shoulder, leaving the other exposed to the candlelight. Her smile, painted crimson red, faded for a moment as her dark eyes met with the detective's from across the opposite side of the room. Their mahogany glow in the firelight radiated with a twinkle in their depths. He felt his lips part as he laid his eyes on her, all at once starved for air as the images of Rose flashed into his mind unwontedly. How his hand pressed tenderly into her curves as he held her close to him, her dark eyes filled with the sparkle of some unspoken mischief. He blinked the images of Rose away as Lucy, like a spectre of doom, floated across the room dressed in black with pale skin accentuated by her raven black hair. But instead of terror, the sight filled him with such conflicting emotions that he fought away the images in his mind that haunted him again and again. She drifted closer until she was leaning on the bar beside him. The bartender turned to offer her a drink, but she put up her hand gently, a silent decline. "You made it," she whispered eagerly. Her breath ghosted across his ears. He struggled to conceal the chill that ran throughout his body as he nodded, "I'm here." Glancing around the room, she leaned closer, barely to whisper, "There are too many people watching here. Look," she paused to point. "There's a bathroom across the room, there. It's a single-stall restroom. Go there, and keep the door unlocked for me." She had just finished saying this as she flitted away, leaving him in wonder. His face began to flush as he processed what she had just said. She wanted to meet him alone in the bathroom? Sebastian tugged at the collar of his dress shirt, feeling too warm as he felt his pulse rush. Clearing his throat, Sebastian stood up from the bar stool as he carefully passed through the crowd, staring intently ahead at nothing in particular, as her words rolled around in his mind. "Keep the door unlocked for me." He might have imagined it, but he was sure the ice in his glass had quickly started melting in his grip as he hurried across the room, feeling the heat radiating off of him as he forced himself to stay focused. As he reached the restroom, He saw indeed that it was a single stall. Carefully, he waited until he was sure no one was looking at him, before he swiftly pulled the door open and stepped inside, closing it behind him. Now, without the sound of the crowd to drown it out, Sebastian could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. He set his soda glass down on the rim of the sink as he composed himself. Running a hand back through his hair, tucking the loose strands that draped near his face, and tugging at his jacket to straighten the fabric which had creased as he sat. Several long minutes seemed to pass before a sudden jiggle at the doorknob made his heart skip a beat in his chest. The young woman slipped through the doorway and quickly turned, closing and latching the lock to the door. The sound of the lock turning resounded loudly in the small bathroom before silence fell over the room, broken only by their staggered breaths. Lucy turned from the door, letting her back rest against it for support as she leaned her head back briefly and breathed. Sebastian kept his distance, struggling to keep his own shallow breaths under control as he waited for her to speak. Her eyes drifted to his, capturing his gaze as she panted, "We're alone." Sebastian swallowed roughly, feeling his mouth going dry as he nodded deeply in response, stepping forward. She stepped forward toward him, her hand lifting to the low cut of her black gown's neckline, dipping her slender fingers beneath the fabric before revealing a small piece of folded paper from the intimate hiding place. He was unsure if he should look away, but the movement was so swift that he didn't have time to decide before the paper was produced. "Here," she said softly, taking another step closer to him as she held the paper out, closing the distance between them. "What is it?" Sebastian asked, taking a small scrap of paper in his hand. "Put it in your pocket. Don't open it here," she ordered softly, her stern gaze locked on his as she spoke. He tucked the folded paper into the pocket of his pants beneath his jacket, sure that the jacket would conceal the paper from wandering eyes as he made his escape from the party. Lucy visibly breathed a sigh of relief after she had passed on the note, her shoulders relaxing and her gaze softening as she breathed out, "Thank you for this. I know it was a strange request to meet me here," she expressed in a voice laced with her newfound relief. "Of course," Sebastian reassured. "It's always my pleasure to help a beautiful woman," he stammered, feeling uncomfortable as he struggled to collect his thoughts. She smiled faintly. "I appreciate it. I really needed—" Sebastian and Lucy both jumped at the sound of a heavy knock on the door. Startled, Lucy's hand bumped the soda glass off the rim of the sink, sending it clattering to the ground as it shattered into hundreds of pieces. "Lucy? Are you okay?" a deep voice asked in an aggressive tone. Lucy visibly tensed. "Yeah, babe, I'm all right. You startled me," she said, trying to calm her voice. "Did something break?" the voice asked, sounding a bit calmer than before. "Yeah," Lucy hesitated. "My wine glass broke. I bumped it off the sink. I'll be right out." Sebastian heard a chuckle from the other side of the door, before the voice answered, "All right, be careful. Don't step on any glass. I'll have a new glass waiting for you when you get out," before the footsteps slowly faded away from the door. Lucy was on the verge of panic, turning to Sebastian as she whispered, "I'll turn off the light and slip out the door. Give me a minute to distract Wade before you slip out too. Try not to be seen, and then get out of here. Do not let anyone find that note on you," she warned, flicking off the light. "Good luck," she whispered as she pulled the door open and slipped out, hurrying away to distract her boyfriend. Sebastian stood breathless in the dark, counting down a full minute before he would try to make a dash for the exit. It was the longest, most lingering, terrifying minute of his life, as he forced himself to slowly count down in his mind before pulling back the knob and slipping out. Lowering his head and filing quickly into the crowd of people, Sebastian set his eyes on the exit, not wanting to know what Chandler would do to him if Sebastian was caught coming out of the bathroom with his girlfriend. And the thought put an extra spring in his stride as he hurried toward the exit. I apologize for my stumbling. I'm having trouble reading today. We come upon Chapter 6, The last chapter I'm going to read for the night before we conclude. This is Chapter 6, A Change of Plans. Keeping his head lowered, Sebastian quickly put as much distance between himself and the bathroom stall as he could, blending into the crowd of mingled town dignitaries, laughing and talking and taking advantage of the open bar. He kept his eyes fixed on the exit across the room, where the darkness beyond would mask his swift escape. Despite his caution, however, as he wove between the people through the tight crowd, a broad hand with a sturdy grip landed on his shoulder, jolting him back abruptly. Jarred by the interruption, Sebastian spun around to face his confronter. A middle-aged man, not much larger than Sebastian, still held his iron grip on his shoulder. The man was squinting intently at him, as the detective aggressively asked, "What?" The figure swayed in place a bit, and Sebastian realized that the man was intoxicated. I, slurred the man. "I know you," he managed to finally say, waving his finger in an accusatory manner. "I doubt that," the detective snorted, brushing off the man's hand from his shoulder. But the stranger lashed out and gripped him by the wrist. No, I do know you. You're a cop. You've pulled me over before. I remember you." The man continued to sway as he pointed a finger in Sebastian's face. The detective shook his head, noticing how people were beginning to turn to stare at their altercation. He realized that he had to get the situation under control, quickly. "You're confusing me with someone else. I'm not a police officer." Which was true. He didn't work for that department anymore. He was technically a self-employed and at-will consulting detective. But no one here needed to know that. But the man was determined, not relenting on his tight grip on the detective's wrist as he spit. "You're lying. I know you are, you stinking pig. You don't belong here," he threatened, releasing his grip to shove Sebastian's shoulders roughly. He stumbled back, but not before gripping onto the collar of the man's jacket, pulling the heavily intoxicated man down with him. Both of them crashed into a wine cart being pushed behind them, tipping the cart and sending glasses and bottles shattering across the ballroom floor in an explosive thunder of crackling glass and splattering wine. Landing in a pool of dark wine, the two men wrestled for control as the drunkard landed a sloppy punch across Sebastian's jaw, cracking his lip. Instantly a stream of blood began to flow down Sebastian's chin as he rolled the man off of him, flipping onto his back and pinning his arms down to his chest. The man howled with pain as he rolled onto the shards of broken glass, blood and wine blending together on the dark marble floor. Some men from the crowd around him lunged for the drunk man's arms, dragging him up as he continued to bellow agonized screams. He was carted toward the door where the two bouncers joined in restraining him as they carried him outside. Sebastian picked himself up off the ground, thankful to have avoided the shards of glass that glittered everywhere across the floor. He stood up, panting for breath, and used his wine-soaked sleeve to wipe away the stream of blood dripping from his chin. "That was quite a scuffle," a low voice said behind him. Sebastian turned his head toward the voice, his face now smudged with blood as he met the eyes of Wade Chandler. The politician was studying the dark-haired man with a clinical gaze. "Are you all right? I can call an ambulance." Sebastian shook his head. "I'll be fine. That man needed it more than I do." "The glass," he indicated to the floor, where the glistening glass pieces waded in pools of dark wine. Wade's eyes drifted about disinterestedly as he lifted a brow. "Yes, I've noticed that. What prompted that little fight between you two?" "A case of mistaken identity," Sebastian said, gruffly, not wanting to explain himself in fear of arousing suspicion. The politician put a hand on the detective's aching shoulder. "Please, let me offer you a stronger drink to relax. I have some excellent whiskey in the lounge. You could rest for a while." Sebastian shook his head. "I'll have to take a rain check. I need to be going." he muttered, nursing his bleeding lip. "Please, excuse me." "I'll owe you a drink, then. Take care," Chandler called after the dark-haired man as he slipped away toward the exit, darting out into the darkness. He watched the detective leave before glancing around at these awestruck guests, the most influential figures in all of Boston. Chandler wondered for a moment as he asked, "Who was that man?" No one answered. He raised his voice and indicated to the door. "Does no one know who that was? Who invited him?" Again, no answer. Beside him, Lucy crossed her bare arms over herself uncomfortably. Chandler glanced up at his girlfriend, studying her for a moment before facing the bouncers returning from the doorway. "Follow him," he ordered, turning his eye to face Lucy as he muttered, "I'd like to get to know our mysterious party crasher better." And that is the end of Chapter 6. Next time, we will begin Chapter 7. But for the meantime, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I very much hope you're enjoying my book. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye!